So I just want to introduce the word palliative because I think most of us have our own definition of what palliative is, and families have their own definition, every family member and every staff member. So I'm almost tempted to throw the word out because it's so hard to standardize that term. But what we're going to be talking about in the next hour, the definition of palliative is more, it's about an approach. It's not about a service. It's not about a team. It's not about funding. It's about the way that we approach care for our frail folks that are living in residential care. And so this circle just gives sort of a framework for thinking about a palliative approach where the whole thing is a palliative approach. When somebody's given a diagnosis that they have a disease that they're going to die from, that there's no cure for it, we switch our thinking because we switch from thinking about curing the person to thinking about supporting them, managing their diseases, maybe curing things that go on within that disease, but we're not going to be curing the disease. So our approach shifts in how we see that person and focusing on what's quality for them. And then as the disease progresses, they move into a phase of advanced illness, but we are still providing a palliative approach. And then the last few days or weeks of life where they might be where they're actively dying, again, all of that is a palliative approach. So oftentimes, I find with nurses anyways, they will think of a palliative approach as being that actively dying phase. For the purposes of this next hour, I'd like you to think about a palliative approach being the whole enchilada, okay? So what does that mean? Oh, it went backwards. So what does that mean? What does it mean when you have a palliative approach with your residents in residential care? Well, what we're suggesting is that means the shift is that you're having conversations with people about what's important to them. You know, the conversation isn't so much about what's the treatment to cure this, the conversation is about what's important. What kinds of things can we do to manage your disease and to keep you comfortable? And what kinds of support, not just for physical comfort, but for psychosocial, spiritual, all that other stuff that is important as well. The other shift is also about giving information early on for decisions that probably will need to be made later on. So, and that's what Trevor's going to really demonstrate beautifully, is having those early conversations when a resident first moves in with the family about decisions that you know are going to need to be made down the road. And then also, of course, talking about provisions for death. So, for example, when you see somebody in acute care, you don't generally ask them what their funeral arrangements are. But a palliative approach would. It would say, you know, because everybody knows this is a disease they're going to die from, so what's important to you? And the nurses will be asking what funeral home and those kinds of things as well. Okay. So it's also about thinking about, I just love this quote, that most chronically ill, older people have ambiguous medical prognosis, and they could be living on thin ice for some years or die in a week. So if you think about the people that you care for in residential care, many of them you think, yeah, you know, it's 50-50. I wouldn't be surprised if Monday when I go back to work, I find out they've died. And many of the people that we care for, it's 50-50 whether they live or die in the next week or so. That's how frail they are. So rather than identifying, I know that person's going to die on Monday, what I'd like you to think about is thinking about their frailty. Are they frail enough to die? And one way of doing that is just asking the question, would I be surprised if they weren't here in the next 6 months or a year or 3 months, whatever time frame you want to put to it? And there was a study in North Vancouver. Was there someone here from North Vancouver? Where they actually put this to the test. And they asked nurses in residential care, would you be surprised if your resident died in the next 6 months? And they found actually the nurses were pretty good at predicting that. Actually, they were a little generous. People usually died before the time that they thought. So I think we're all pretty good at identifying frailty, but maybe just not acknowledging it. And that's something that I think all of us can work more on. And one of those things is just, so what does frailty mean? And it's about focusing on their functional decline as opposed to their hemoglobin A1C or their blood pressures or whatever other numbers, but really focusing on, so in the last couple of months, how have they changed and how has their function changed? And if there's been a big functional decline, chances are they're getting more frail. And are they frail enough to die? That thinking about that, I think, is really, really important when you're coming to looking at medications. What are appropriate or inappropriate medications for somebody changes if they're frail enough to die.